the tranquil village of St. Mary Mead, a shadowy stranger lingers at the church gate, stirring whispers of secrets and sin. When cryptic letters threaten to unravel hidden truths, and a collection box bears marks of tampering, Miss Jane Marple, with her keen eye and quiet wisdom, steps into the mystery. As past grievances resurface and tensions rise, she unravels a web of vengeance and redemption, proving that even the smallest village hides the deepest secrets. Join Miss Marple in a tale of suspense, where every glance and whisper holds a clue to the truth. Chapter 1. The Village Stir. In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, where the days unfolded with the predictable rhythm of a well-wound clock, the autumn of 1928 brought an unexpected ripple. The leaves had turned a crisp amber, and the air carried the faint chill of approaching winter. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her favourite armchair by the window of her neat cottage, was absorbed in her knitting. A delicate lace shawl, her needles moving with the precision of long habit. Her eyes, however, were not on the wool, but on the world beyond her lace curtains, where the village green lay bathed in the soft light of late afternoon. It was then that she noticed him, a stranger, standing by the ancient stone gate of St. Mary's Church. He was tall, his figure angular beneath a dark overcoat that seemed too heavy for the mild weather. A low-brimmed hat cast a shadow over his face, rendering his features indistinct. He stood motionless, his posture rigid, as if fixed to the spot by some unspoken purpose. Miss Marple's fingers paused, the needles stilled. "How very curious," she murmured to herself, her voice barely audible over the faint rustle of leaves outside. St. Mary Mead was not accustomed to strangers. Visitors were rare, and those who came were typically relatives or tradesmen, easily accounted for by the village's efficient network of gossip. This man, however, was an enigma. He did not enter the church, nor did he approach the vicarage nearby. He simply stood, his gaze fixed on the weathered stone of the church's facade, as if searching for something hidden in its ancient masonry. Miss Marple's sharp eyes noted the way his hands remained deep in his pockets, the slight tilt of his head, as if listening for a sound only he could hear. The village, too, had taken notice. As Miss Marple sipped her tea later that day, her maid Florence bustled in with the day's tidings. "There's talk, miss," Florence said, setting down a tray of biscuits with a clatter. "Mrs. Weatherby saw a man by the church gate last evening, just standing there, bold as brass. And Mr. Giles, the butcher, says he saw him again this morning. Same spot, same look about him. Not a word to anyone, mind you." Florence's tone carried the indignation of a villager whose routine had been disturbed. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene but her mind alert. "Did they say what he looked like?" "Florence?" she asked, her voice mild. "Tall, they say, and dressed like a city gent, though his coat's seen better days. Mrs. Weatherby swears he's up to no good. Loitering like that, it's not natural." Florence shook her head, her hands smoothing her apron. "What do you make of it, miss?" Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "People do not loiter without purpose, Florence," she said, her eyes drifting back to the window. "Even idleness has its reasons." She resumed her knitting, but her thoughts were elsewhere, turning over the stranger's presence like a puzzle piece that did not yet fit. By evening, the village was abuzz with speculation. At the Blue Boar, the local pub, Mr. Giles recounted his sighting to a small crowd, embellishing the stranger's sinister air. Mrs. Weatherby, ever the dramatist, hinted at nefarious intentions, perhaps theft or worse. Yet no one could say who he was or why he had come. The church, a modest structure with its squat tower and ivy-clad walls, seemed an unlikely target for intrigue. It held no great treasures, only the quiet devotion of a small congregation and the occasional silver candlestick, polished to a gleam by the vicar's wife. Miss Marple, however, knew that appearances could deceive. She had lived long enough in St. Mary Mead to understand that even the smallest village harboured secrets, petty jealousies, hidden shames, or old wounds left to fester. The stranger's vigil by the church gate suggested something more than idle curiosity. Was he watching for someone, or was the church itself the object of his interest? Her mind flickered to the vicar, Mr. Clement, a kind but distracted man, and to the churchwarden, Mr. Harrow, whose recent limp had not escaped her notice. People she knew were rarely what they seemed. As dusk settled over St. Mary Mead, the stranger vanished as abruptly as he had appeared. No one saw him leave, and the church gate stood empty under the rising moon. Yet the village's unease lingered, like a shadow cast by an unseen cloud. Miss Marple, setting aside her knitting, gazed out at the now darkened green. "A stranger brings change," she mused, her voice soft but certain. "And change in a place like this is seldom without consequence." She rose, her movements deliberate, and drew the curtains closed. Tomorrow she would pay a visit to the vicarage. Mr. Clement, she suspected, might have more to say than he realised. And Miss Marple, with her quiet ways and unerring instinct, was determined to uncover the truth behind the stranger at the church gate. Chapter 2. The Vicar's Tale. The morning after the stranger's appearance at the church gate, St. Mary Mead awoke to a sky heavy with clouds, the air thick with the promise of rain. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her breakfast table with a pot of tea and a slice of toast, considered the village's latest curiosity. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door, firm but not urgent, the kind that suggested a visitor with a purpose. Florence, her maid, ushered in the vicar, Mr. Leonard Clement, whose usually serene face bore the faint creases of worry. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, settling into the chair she offered with a gesture of her delicate hand. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, but I find myself in need of, well, not advice exactly, but perhaps your perspective." Miss Marple's eyes, bright and perceptive behind her spectacles, met his with a reassuring smile. "You are never a disturbance, Mr. Clement. Pray, tell me what troubles you." She poured him a cup of tea, her movements precise, and waited with the patience of one accustomed to unravelling the tangles of human affairs. The vicar hesitated, his fingers tracing the rim of the cup. "It's the church, you see," he began. "Yesterday evening, after evensong, I noticed something peculiar. The collection box, near the vestry, you know, the old oak one with the iron lock, it had been tampered with. The lock was scratched, as if someone had tried to force it open. Nothing was taken, mind you, but the marks were unmistakable." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly, though her expression remained composed. "Tampered with, you say? How very curious. And this was discovered after the stranger was seen at the church gate." Mr. Clement's eyes widened. "You've heard about him, then? I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. The village does talk." He sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Yes, it was after his appearance. I can't help but wonder if the two are connected, though why anyone would target a humble collection box is beyond me. It holds a few shillings at most." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind already sifting through possibilities. "People do the oddest things for the smallest reasons, Mr. Clement," she said softly. "But tell me, have there been any other irregularities? Anything out of the ordinary at the church?" The vicar's hesitation deepened, and he shifted in his chair. "Well, there is one thing," he admitted, his voice lowering. "This morning I found a letter slipped under the vicarage door. It was unsettling, to say the least." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a single sheet of paper, folded neatly but creased, as if handled with nervous fingers. He passed it to Miss Marple, who unfolded it with care. The letter was written in a bold, slanting hand, the ink black and uneven, as if penned in haste. It read, "Sins will be uncovered at St. Mary's. The truth cannot stay buried." There was no signature, no address, only those stark words staring up from the page. Miss Marple read it twice, her lips pursed. "A warning or a threat, Mr. Clement?" she asked, her tone mild but her gaze sharp. "I cannot say," he replied, his voice tinged with unease. "It feels personal, though I've no idea why. I've served this parish for 15 years, and I like to think I've done so with integrity. But this," he gestured helplessly at the letter. "It's as if someone believes I've something to hide." Miss Marple folded the letter and returned it to him, her mind already turning over the implications. "And the stranger," she said. "Did you see him yourself?" "Only from a distance," Mr. Clement admitted. "Last evening, as I locked the church after evensong, I noticed a figure by the gate. Tall, in a dark coat, just as the village describes. He didn't approach, but he watched me. I'm certain of it. By the time I thought to call out, he was gone." Miss Marple nodded, her fingers tapping lightly on the arm of her chair. "And the church itself? Has anything else caught your attention? Visitors, perhaps, or changes in routine?" The vicar frowned, considering. "Well, there's Mr. Harrow, the churchwarden. He's been rather distracted of late. I attributed it to his recent injury. A fall from a ladder, you know, which left him with a limp. But he's been spending more time at the church, checking the books and the vestry, almost as if he's looking for something. I thought it diligence, but now—" His voice trailed off, and he shook his head. "Perhaps I'm reading too much into it." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but her eyes gleamed with interest. "One can never read too much into human behaviour, Mr. Clement. It is often the smallest details that tell the largest stories." She paused, then added, "Might I see the collection box myself? It would help to understand the nature of this tampering." The vicar agreed readily, and within the hour they were walking across the village green towards St. Mary's Church. The sky had grown darker, the clouds pressing low, and a damp wind stirred the fallen leaves. The church stood at the edge of the green, its grey stone walls softened by ivy, its tower squat and unassuming. Miss Marple, her shawl drawn tightly about her, moved with a sprightly step that belied her years, her eyes scanning the surroundings with quiet intensity. Inside, the church was cool and dim, the air heavy with the scent of polished wood and old hymnals. The collection box stood near the vestry door, a sturdy oak construction with a slotted lid and an iron lock that gleamed dully in the filtered light. Miss Marple examined it closely, noting the fresh scratches around the keyhole, shallow but deliberate, as if made with a thin tool, perhaps a screwdriver or a knife. "Not the work of an amateur," she murmured. "But not a professional either. Someone testing their skill, perhaps." Mr. Clement watched her, his expression a mix of curiosity and unease. "Do you think it's serious, Miss Marple? Should I inform the police?" She straightened, her face thoughtful. "Not yet, Mr. Clement. The police are excellent for action, but they sometimes miss the subtleties. Let us observe a little longer. This stranger and this letter suggest a purpose we do not yet understand. It would be unwise to act before we know more." They returned to the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement, a cheerful woman with a penchant for gardening, offered them scones and more tea. Miss Marple accepted with her usual courtesy, but her mind was elsewhere, piecing together the fragments of the morning's revelations, the stranger's vigil, the tampered lock, the cryptic letter, all pointed to a disturbance in the quiet fabric of St. Mary Mead. And then there was Mr. Harrow, the churchwarden, whose distraction and limp had caught her attention. She recalled seeing him at the village shop the previous week, his face pale and his manner hurried, as if pursued by an unseen worry. "Mr. Clement," she said, setting down her teacup, "might I ask about Mr. Harrow's duties as churchwarden? Does he handle the church funds?" "Oh, yes," the vicar replied. "He's meticulous about the accounts, always has been. He keeps the ledger, records the collections, and sees to the repairs. Since his accident, he's been even more attentive. though I confess I've wondered if it's taken a toll on him. He seems burdened." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unreadable. "Burdened," she repeated softly. "Yes, that is often how it begins." She did not elaborate, but her mind was already tracing connections. A burdened man, a tampered lock, a stranger with a purpose. Each was a thread in a pattern she could not yet fully discern. As she took her leave, the first drops of rain began to fall, pattering against the vicarage windows. Miss Marple declined the offer of an umbrella, her thoughts too occupied to mind the weather. She walked slowly back to her cottage, her eyes scanning the village green, now deserted save for a lone crow perched on the church gate. The stranger had not reappeared, but his presence lingered in her mind, as did the letter's ominous words. "Sins will be uncovered." Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled by the fire, her knitting resumed, but her thoughts far from the lace shawl in her hands. She considered the village's cast of characters. Mr. Clement, earnest but naive. Mr. Harrow, diligent yet troubled. And the stranger, whose identity remained a shadow. She thought, too, of Mrs. Price, the sharp-eyed widow who lived near the church, and whose tongue was as quick as her memory. Mrs. Price had seen the stranger Miss Marple recalled, and might have noticed more than she realised. The rain grew heavier, drumming against the windows, and Miss Marple's needles clicked in rhythm with her thoughts. A village is like a tapestry, she mused, each thread essential, each knot a story. The stranger at the church gate was a new thread, one that did not yet belong, but Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom and unerring instinct, was determined to find where it fit and what secrets it might unravel. As the fire crackled and the storm gathered strength, she resolved to visit Mrs. Price the next day. The widow's observations, she suspected, would shed light on the stranger's purpose, and perhaps on the deeper currents stirring in St. Mary Mead. For now, she set aside her knitting and gazed into the flames, her mind weaving a pattern only she could see. Chapter 3. The Widow's Secret. The rain that had begun the previous evening had softened to a fine mist by morning, cloaking St. Mary Mead in a delicate veil that lent the village an air of quiet mystery. Miss Jane Marple, undeterred by the damp, set out after breakfast for the cottage of Mrs. Amelia Price, a widow whose sharp eyes and sharper tongue made her a repository of village lore. Her home, a neat dwelling with a garden of late-blooming roses, stood close to St. Mary's Church, its windows commanding a clear view of the church gate. If anyone had observed the stranger closely, Miss Marple reasoned, it would be Mrs. Price. As she approached, Miss Marple noted the widow's curtains twitch, a sign of vigilance that did not surprise her. Mrs. Price was known for her watchfulness, a habit born of years spent guarding her reputation and her privacy. The door opened before Miss Marple could knock, and Mrs. Price stood there, her thin frame erect, her grey hair pinned tightly beneath a lace cap. Her eyes, bright with suspicion, softened only slightly at the sight of her visitor. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Mrs. Price said, her voice crisp. "I suppose you're here about that man at the church gate. The village can talk of nothing else." Miss Marple smiled, her demeanour as gentle as ever. "You are quite right, Mrs. Price. I thought you might have seen something the others missed. May I come in?" Mrs. Price stepped aside, gesturing toward a small parlour where a fire burned briskly. The room was immaculate, its furniture polished to a gleam, though the air held a faint chill, as if warmth were rationed. Miss Marple settled into a chair, declining the offer of tea, but accepting a biscuit from a tin adorned with a faded rose pattern. She knew better than to rush Mrs. Price, whose information came most freely when she felt in command of the conversation. "I saw him, all right," Mrs. Price began, seating herself opposite Miss Marple. "Twice, in fact. The first time was 2 evenings ago, just before dusk. He stood by the church gate, bold as you please, staring at the vicarage. Not the church, mind you. The vicarage. I thought it odd, the way he tilted his head, like he was measuring the place. His coat was dark, a bit shabby, and that hat of his hid his face. But I'd wager he's no older than 40. Miss Marple nodded, her hands folded neatly in her lap. And the second time, yesterday morning early, Mrs. Price said, her lips pursing. I was tending my roses when I saw him again. Same spot, same coat. This time, he was watching the church itself, pacing a bit, as if he meant to go in but changed. His mind. He moved deliberately, like a man with a plan. I don't trust that sort, Miss Marple. Loitering never bodes well. Did he speak to anyone? Miss Marple asked, her tone mild but her eyes keen. Not a soul, Mrs. Price replied. He kept to himself, and when Mr. Harrow came by, on his way to the vestry, I suppose, the man turned away sharpish, as if he didn't want to be seen. That's when I knew he was up to something. Miss Marple's interest sharpened at the mention of the churchwarden. Mr. Harrow, you say? Did he notice the stranger? Mrs. Price sniffed. If he did, he didn't let on. Limping along as usual, head down, looking worried. He's been like that ever since his fall, though I reckon it's more than a sore leg troubling him. He's always been a bit too fond of the church's business, if you ask me. Miss Marple's smile was faint but encouraging. You have a keen eye, Mrs. Price. Have you noticed anything else unusual? About the church, perhaps, or its visitors? The widow hesitated, her fingers smoothing the edge of her apron. Well, there's one thing, she said at last, her voice dropping. It's not about the stranger, but it might matter. My nephew, Leonard. He's been mentioned in the village, hasn't he? I know the talk, Miss Marple. They say he's back, though I've not seen him myself. But I'll tell you this. Leonard was always trouble. Left St. Mary Mead 5 years ago after that business with the shopkeeper's till. Never proven, mind you, but mud sticks. Miss Marple's expression remained serene, though her mind was alight with connections. Leonard, she repeated softly. Yes, I recall the gossip. You believe he might be connected to this stranger? Mrs. Price's eyes narrowed. I wouldn't put it past him. He wrote to me last month, asking for money, bold as brass. Said he was in London, but I didn't believe him. Leonard's the sort to turn up unannounced, stirring trouble. If he's back, and if he's that stranger, he's got no business near the church. He never cared for religion, only what he could take from it. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle but probing. And this letter from Leonard, did it mention the church or anyone in the village? Mrs. Price shook her head. Not a word about the church. Just his usual complaints. Hard times, bad luck, you know the sort. I sent him nothing, of course. I've no patience for his nonsense. She paused, then added, But if he's here, Miss Marple, he's not come to see me. That's what worries me. Leonard always had a grudge, especially against those who crossed him. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts turning to the tampered collection box and the vicar's letter. A grudge can be a powerful motive, she said, almost to herself. Thank you, Mrs. Price. You've been most helpful. As she rose to leave, Mrs. Price followed her to the door, her expression a mix of curiosity and unease. You'll let me know if you find out who that stranger is, won't you? She said. I don't like mysteries in my own backyard. Miss Marple's smile was reassuring. I shall do my best, Mrs. Price. Mysteries, after all, are meant to be unravelled. The mist had lifted as Miss Marple stepped outside, though the air remained damp and cool. She walked slowly toward the church, her mind sifting through Mrs. Price's words. Leonard's name had surfaced again, as it had in the village gossip, and his history of trouble cast a new light on the stranger's presence. Was he indeed the man at the church gate, driven by some old grievance? And what of Mr. Harrow, whose distraction and proximity to the church suggested more than mere duty? She paused at the church gate, her eyes tracing the path the stranger had paced. The stone was worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, and the gate itself creaked faintly in the breeze. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the vicarage, its windows dark under the overcast sky. Mrs. Price's observation that the stranger had watched the vicarage, not just the church, struck her as significant. It suggested a personal interest, perhaps in Mr. Clement himself or in someone connected to him. As she stood there, a figure emerged from the church, Mr. Harrow, his limp pronounced as he carried a ledger under his arm. He started at the sight of Miss Marple, his face paling. "Oh, Miss Marple," he said, recovering quickly. "I didn't see you there. Just checking the accounts, you know. Always something to be done." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her tone pleasant, but her eyes watchful. "You take your duties very seriously, Mr. Harrow. The church is fortunate to have you." He mumbled a reply, his gaze flickering toward the gate before he hurried away. Miss Marple watched him go, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand clutched the ledger as if it were a shield. A man with something to hide, she thought, or something to fear. Returning to her cottage, Miss Marple settled by her window, her knitting untouched as she considered the morning's findings. Leonard's return, real or rumoured, added a layer to the mystery. Mrs. Price's bitterness toward her nephew suggested a family rift, one that might explain the stranger's interest in the church, or the vicarage, the tampered collection box, the anonymous letter, Mr. Harrow's unease. All were pieces of a puzzle that did not yet fit. But Miss Marple, with her quiet patience and keen understanding of human nature, knew that patterns emerged in time. She rose to make tea, her thoughts circling back to the church gate. "A stranger brings questions," she mused, "but answers lie with those we know." Tomorrow, she would seek out more of the village's voices, perhaps at the shop or the post office, where tongues wagged freely. For now, she sipped her tea and watched the clouds drift, certain that the stranger's purpose and the secrets he stirred would soon come to light. Chapter 4. The Shadow of the Past. The morning mist had burned away, leaving St. Mary Mead bathed in the pale sunlight of an autumn day. Miss Jane Marple, having finished her breakfast, donned her coat and hat, her mind fixed on the threads of the mystery that had begun to weave themselves around the church gate. The stranger, the tampered collection box, the cryptic letter, and now the whispers of Leonard Price's return, all pointed to a disturbance in the village's quiet rhythm. Determined to trace these threads, Miss Marple set out for the village hall, where the weekly sewing circle was sure to be abuzz with the latest talk. The hall, a modest building with creaking floorboards and a faint smell of polish, was filled with the hum of conversation as women bent over their needlework. Miss Marple slipped in quietly, her presence scarcely noticed amid the chatter. She took a seat beside Mrs. Weatherby, whose penchant for gossip rivaled even Mrs. Price's, and began to thread a needle with her usual care. The talk, as she had anticipated, soon turned to the stranger. "He was at the church gate again last night," Mrs. Weatherby said, her voice low but eager. "Mr. Giles saw him, clear as day, just before the rain started, standing there, bold as brass, watching the vicarage like he expected someone to come out." Miss Marple's needle paused, though her expression remained serene. "How curious," she said. "Did Mr. Giles speak to him?" "Not a chance," Mrs. Weatherby replied, her eyes gleaming. "The man slipped away when he saw Mr. Giles coming. But there's more. Mrs. Carter at the post office says she's heard Leonard Price is back. You remember him, don't you? That business with the shopkeeper's till, years ago. Never proven, but folk don't forget." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the details. "Leonard Price," she said softly. "Yes, I recall. A troubled young man. Has anyone seen him in the village?" "Not outright," Mrs. Weatherby admitted. "But Mrs. Carter says a man matching his description took a room at the Blue Boar 2 days ago. Calling himself Mr. Lane, if you please, but she's certain it's Leonard. Same height, same sullen look, she says." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "The village does have a way of noticing things," she said. "And this Mr. Lane, has he been seen near the church?" Mrs. Weatherby leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "That's just it. Mrs. Carter's boy saw him walking toward the church yesterday morning, before the stranger was spotted again. It's got people thinking, could Leonard be our mysterious visitor?" The conversation shifted to other matters, but Miss Marple's thoughts remained fixed on Leonard Price. His return, if true, was no coincidence. Mrs. Price's bitterness toward her nephew, coupled with the stranger's interest in the vicarage, suggested a purpose rooted in the past. The tampered collection box and the anonymous letter only deepened the puzzle. Miss Marple finished her stitching and took her leave, her mind already set on a visit to the Blue Boar. The inn, a sturdy building with a thatched roof and a sign that creaked in the breeze, stood at the edge of the village. Its landlord, Mr. Dobbs, greeted Miss Marple with a nod, his face weathered but friendly. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said. "Not often we see you here. Looking for someone?" Miss Marple's smile was disarming. "Just a word, Mr. Dobbs, if you have a moment. I understand you have a new guest. Mr. Lane, is it?" Mr. Dobbs's eyes narrowed slightly, though his tone remained polite. "Aye, that's right. Took a room 2 days ago. Quiet sort, keeps to himself, paid in advance, which is more than some do." "May I ask what he looks like?" Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but her gaze steady. "Tall, dark hair, a bit gaunt," Mr. Dobbs replied. "Wears a heavy coat and a hat pulled low. Not much for conversation, but he's no trouble." He hesitated, then added, "He asked about the church, though. Wanted to know when services are held and who looks after the place. Seemed curious, but I thought nothing of it." Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions confirmed. "Thank you, Mr. Dobbs. You've been most helpful." She left the inn, her steps measured but purposeful. The description matched Mrs. Price's account of the stranger, and the mention of Leonard's name in the village gossip pointed to a single conclusion. Mr. Lane was indeed Leonard Price, returned under an assumed name. His interest in the church, coupled with his furtive behaviour, suggested a motive beyond mere curiosity. As she walked back toward the village green, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the vicar's letter. "Sins will be uncovered." The words carried a personal edge, as if aimed at someone specific. Mr. Clement had seemed genuinely puzzled, but Miss Marple knew that secrets often lay hidden in plain sight. She recalled Mr. Harrow's distracted manner, his limp, and his frequent visits to the vestry. Was he the target of the letter, or merely a bystander caught in its shadow? Her musings were interrupted by a commotion near the post office. Mrs. Carter, the postmistress, was speaking animatedly to a small group, her voice carrying across the green. Miss Marple approached, her presence unassuming, but her ears attuned to every word. "It came this morning," Mrs. Carter was saying, holding up an envelope. "Another letter for the vicar. Slipped through the slot before dawn. Same handwriting as the first, I'd wager. I sent my boy to deliver it, but it's got folk worried. What's going on at that church?" Miss Marple joined the group, her expression one of mild concern. "Another letter, Mrs. Carter," she said. "How troubling. Did you see who left it?" Mrs. Carter shook her head. "Not a soul, but it's the same as before. No name, no address, just those bold letters. I caught a glimpse before I sealed it up. It said something about truth at midnight. Sounds like a threat to me." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face betrayed nothing. "Midnight," she repeated softly. "How very dramatic. I suppose the vicar will want to know at once." She excused herself and made her way to the vicarage, where Mr. Clement was already reading the new letter. His face was pale, his hands unsteady as he handed it to Miss Marple. The message was brief but chilling. "The truth will be revealed at midnight. St. Mary's will not hide its secrets." "This is most alarming," Mr. Clement said, his voice strained. "I've no idea what it means, Miss Marple, but it feels sinister." Should I call the police? Miss Marple folded the letter carefully, her mind racing. Not yet, Mr. Clement, she said. The police are thorough, but they can be heavy-handed. Let us watch and listen a little longer. This mention of midnight suggests a plan, and plans can be observed. The vicar nodded, though his unease was evident. You think this is connected to the stranger, don't you? And the collection box? It is possible, Miss Marple replied, her tone measured. But possibilities are not certainties. I think perhaps a closer look at the church tonight might be wise. If something is to happen at midnight, we should be prepared. Mr. Clement agreed, though his reluctance was clear. Miss Marple left the vicarage with a plan forming in her mind. Leonard Price, if he was the stranger, was no idle loiterer. His interest in the church, his assumed name, and the letters all pointed to a deliberate purpose. And Mr. Harrow, with his ledger and his limp, seemed caught in the same web, whether as victim or accomplice. As evening fell, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, her thoughts as sharp as the needles in her knitting basket. She would need an ally for the midnight vigil, someone with keen eyes and a discreet tongue. Mrs. Price, despite her sharpness, might be persuaded to help, given her proximity to the church and her personal stake in Leonard's actions. Miss Marple resolved to call on her that evening, framing the request as a matter of village duty. Sitting by her fire, she gazed out at the darkening green, where the church stood silent under the gathering clouds. A shadow from the past, she murmured. But whose past, and what truth does it seek? The answer, she knew, lay in the hours ahead, and Miss Marple, with her quiet resolve, was ready to meet it. Chapter 5. The Midnight Vigil. The night was moonless, the sky over St. Mary Mead a heavy canopy of clouds that seemed to press down upon the village, muffling sound and light. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a dark shawl that blended with the shadows, stood just inside the churchyard, her slight figure concealed by the yew trees that flanked the ancient stone wall. Beside her, Mrs. Amelia Price, persuaded by a mixture of curiosity and civic duty, shifted uneasily, her sharp eyes scanning the darkness. Miss Marple had called on her that evening, framing the vigil as a necessary step to protect the village's peace. And though Mrs. Price had grumbled about the hour and the chill, she had agreed to assist. "It's past 11, Mrs. Price whispered, her voice low but edged with impatience. "If this is some fool's errand, Miss Marple, I'll not thank you for dragging me out in this damp." Miss Marple's smile was invisible in the dark, but her tone was calm. "Patience, Mrs. Price. Midnight is the hour mentioned, and people who write such letters are often precise about their timing. We shall not have long to wait." The church loomed before them, its silhouette barely discernible against the clouded sky. The gate, where the stranger had been seen, stood slightly ajar, creaking faintly in the breeze. Miss Marple's eyes, accustomed to the gloom, noted every detail: the faint glow from the vicarage windows, the rustle of leaves stirred by the wind, the distant bark of a dog. She had chosen this spot carefully, hidden yet with a clear view of the gate and the path to the church door. If the stranger, or Leonard Price as she strongly suspected, intended to act at midnight, he would not pass unnoticed. Mrs. Price, clutching her shawl, muttered under her breath, "If it's Leonard, as you think, he's got no business skulking about. I told you he's trouble, always has been. But what's he after? The collection box. There's nothing in it worth stealing." Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm. "It may not be about money, Mrs. Price. Some motives are deeper than greed, revenge perhaps, or a need to settle an old score. We shall see soon enough." As the church clock struck the quarter hour, a faint sound reached them, a crunch of gravel on the path beyond the gate. Miss Marple's hand touched Mrs. Price's arm, a silent signal to be still. A figure appeared, tall and angular, his dark coat blending with the night. The brim of his hat obscured his face, but his movements were deliberate, purposeful. He paused at the gate, glancing toward the vicarage, then moved swiftly toward the church door, a small object glinting in his hand. A tool, perhaps a screwdriver or a pick. "That's him," Mrs. Price hissed, her voice barely audible. "I'd know that walk anywhere. It's Leonard, sure as I'm standing here." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes fixed on the figure. He knelt by the collection box near the vestry, his hands working quickly at the lock. The scratches Miss Marple had observed earlier suggested this was not his first attempt, but tonight he seemed determined to succeed. She watched, her mind racing. Was this a simple theft, or something more complex, tied to the letters and the stranger's vigil? Before she could ponder further, a second figure emerged from the shadows near the church porch. This one moved with a halting gait, a limp evident even in the dim light. Miss Marple's breath caught as she recognized the silhouette. Mr. Harrow, the churchwarden. He approached Leonard, his voice low but sharp, carrying just enough for Miss Marple to catch fragments. "What you're doing? Leave it be." Mr. Harrow's tone was urgent, almost pleading. Leonard's reply was a harsh whisper. "You've no right. I know what you did. It ends tonight." The words were cut short by a sudden movement. Leonard lunged, as if to push past Mr. Harrow, who grabbed his arm. A brief scuffle ensued, the two men grappling in the darkness, their breaths heavy. The tool fell to the ground with a metallic clink, and Leonard broke free, vanishing into the night. Mr. Harrow, panting, hesitated, then retrieved the tool before limping back toward the vicarage, his figure swallowed by the shadows. Mrs. Price clutched Miss Marple's arm, her voice trembling. "What was that about? Leonard and Mr. Harrow, fighting like thieves. I told you he was trouble." Miss Marple's expression was unreadable, but her mind was alight with new connections. "Indeed, Mrs. Price," she said softly, "but it seems Mr. Harrow is not merely a bystander. That limp of his, it's unmistakable. And those words, they suggest a shared history, one neither wishes to see the light of day." They waited a few moments longer, ensuring the churchyard was empty, before stepping out from their hiding place. Miss Marple examined the collection box, noting fresh scratches on the lock, deeper than before. The attempt had been interrupted, but the intent was clear. She picked up a small twig that had fallen during the scuffle, turning it over in her fingers, as if it held some secret of its own. "We should go," Mrs. Price said, her voice uneasy. "This is no place to be at this hour." Miss Marple agreed, and they made their way back to the village, the darkness pressing close. As they parted at Mrs. Price's gate, Miss Marple offered a reassuring smile. "You've been a great help, Mrs. Price. Say nothing of this to anyone if you please. We must let the truth unfold in its own time." Back at her cottage, Miss Marple lit a single candle and sat by her fire, her knitting untouched. The events of the midnight vigil had confirmed her suspicions. Leonard Price was the stranger, and his purpose was tied to Mr. Harrow. The scuffle, the dropped tool, and the cryptic words, "I know what you did," pointed to a confrontation rooted in the past. The letters, with their talk of sins and truth, were likely Leonard's doing, a means to unsettle or expose someone, perhaps Mr. Harrow himself. She considered Mr. Harrow's role, his limp, his distraction, his presence at the church at such an hour, all suggested a man under pressure. Was he protecting a secret, or merely caught in Leonard's vendetta? The collection box, she suspected, was a distraction, a way to draw attention while the real motive lay elsewhere. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the vicarage, where Leonard's gaze had so often lingered. Was Mr. Clement the true target, or was he merely a convenient shield for a deeper grudge? As the candle flickered, Miss Marple's mind wove the threads together. Leonard's return, the letters, Mr. Harrow's unease, the tampered lock, all were part of a pattern, one that spoke of old wrongs and hidden truths. She resolved to speak with Mr. Harrow directly, to gauge his reactions and perhaps uncover what he feared. A man with a secret, she knew, was often his own worst enemy, betraying himself in the smallest ways. The clock struck 1, and Miss Marple rose, her movements slow but purposeful. Tomorrow, she would invite Mr. Harrow for tea, framing it as a neighbourly gesture. Her questions would be gentle, her manner disarming, but her purpose unshakable. The stranger at the church gate had stirred a storm in St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom, was determined to see it through to its end. Chapter 6. The Churchwarden's Burden. The morning following the midnight vigil dawned crisp and clear, with a sharp autumn light that cast long shadows across St. Mary Mead. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her breakfast table, sipped her tea and reflected on the events she and Mrs. Price had witnessed. The scuffle between Leonard Price and Mr. Harrow, the churchwarden, had confirmed her suspicions of a deeper conflict, one rooted in a shared history that neither man wished exposed. The anonymous letters, the tampered collection box, and Leonard's furtive presence all pointed to a purpose that went beyond mere theft. Miss Marple, with her keen understanding of human nature, knew that the next step was to probe Mr. Harrow's role in the unfolding drama. She sent a note to Mr. Harrow, inviting him for tea that afternoon, under the pretext of discussing the church's upcoming harvest festival. The invitation was worded, with her usual courtesy, designed to put him at ease while allowing her to observe him closely. As she prepared her parlour, setting out a tray of scones and her best china, Miss Marple considered how best to draw out the truth. Mr. Harrow, she suspected, was a man carrying a burden, and burdened men often revealed more than they intended under gentle questioning. At precisely 3 o'clock, Mr. Harrow arrived, his limp more pronounced as he navigated the narrow path to her cottage. His face, usually composed, bore signs of strain. His eyes were shadowed, and his hands fidgeted with the brim of his hat as he settled into the armchair she offered. Miss Marple poured the tea, her movements deliberate, her smile warm, but her gaze watchful. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Harrow," she said, passing him a cup. "I thought it might be pleasant to discuss the harvest festival. You've been so diligent with the church's affairs, and I'm sure you have ideas for the event." Mr. Harrow managed a weak smile, though his fingers tightened around the cup. "You're kind to say so, Miss Marple," he replied. "I do my best, though it's been challenging of late. My injury, you know, it slows me down." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, her eyes never leaving his face. "It must be difficult, managing your duties with such a hindrance. I noticed you at the church yesterday, carrying the ledger. You seem to spend a great deal of time there." His expression flickered, a momentary unease crossing his features before he masked it with a sip of tea. "The accounts require attention," he said. "With the festival coming, there's much to organise. Collections, repairs, that sort of thing." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone mild, "though it must be trying, with all this talk of a stranger about, and those letters to the vicar. Most unsettling." "Have you seen anything unusual yourself, Mr. Harrow? Being so often at the church, you'd surely notice." Mr. Harrow's hand trembled slightly, and a drop of tea spilled onto the saucer. He set the cup down, his movements careful. "I've heard the talk," he said, his voice low. "The stranger, the letters, it's all gossip, isn't it? People love to make mountains out of molehills." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but her question was pointed. "Perhaps, though the collection box being tampered with is no small matter. And those letters, sins uncovered, truth at midnight, they suggest someone knows something, or believes they do. Have you any thoughts on who might write such things?" Mr. Harrow's face paled, and he shifted in his chair, his bad leg stretched out awkwardly. "I've no idea," he said too quickly. "Some prank, likely. The village is full of idle tongues." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but insistent. "Mr. Harrow, you've always been a pillar of the church. If something troubles you, it would be a relief to share it, would it not? Burdens grow heavier when carried alone." For a moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock. Mr. Harrow's eyes met hers, and she saw a flash of fear, followed by resignation. He leaned back, his shoulders sagging. "You're a perceptive woman, Miss Marple," he said at last. "I suppose there's no harm in admitting. I've had troubles, financial ones mostly. Years ago, before I came to St. Mary Mead, I made mistakes. Debts, you understand. I've tried to put them behind me, but the church funds, they're a temptation, even for an honest man." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, though her mind was alert. "A temptation," she repeated. "But you've not acted on it, have you, Mr. Harrow?" He shook his head vehemently. "Never, I swear it. I've checked the accounts twice over, kept everything in order. But lately, I've felt watched, as if someone knows about my past and means to use it against me." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts racing. "And this stranger, have you seen him? Or perhaps spoken to him?" Mr. Harrow hesitated, his fingers twisting the edge of his coat. I thought I saw someone near the church last night late, but it was dark, and with my leg I didn't pursue it. I assumed it was just a passerby." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her smile did not waver. She knew he was lying. His limp had been unmistakable in the churchyard, his voice clear during the scuffle with Leonard. But she did not press him, choosing instead to let his unease simmer. "How distressing," she said. "Well, I'm sure it will all come clear in time. Thank you for being so candid, Mr. Harrow." As he rose to leave, his movements stiff, Miss Marple noted the ledger he still carried, clutched tightly under his arm. She saw him to the door, her mind piecing together the fragments of his confession. His financial troubles, his fear of being watched, and his presence at the church at midnight all pointed to a man caught in a trap, one perhaps set by Leonard Price. That evening, as Miss Marple sat by her fire, a knock at the door announced the arrival of Mr. Clement, his face ashen. "Another letter," he said, holding it out to her. "Found it in the vestry this afternoon. It's worse than the others, Miss Marple." She took the letter, her hands steady as she unfolded it. The handwriting was the same bold scrawl, the words more menacing. "The vicar hides a grave sin. It will be exposed, and St. Mary's will bear witness." Miss Marple's lips pursed. "This is no prank, Mr. Clement," she said. "Someone means to cause trouble, and I suspect they are closer than we think." The vicar wrung his hands. "But what sin? I've done nothing to warrant this. My conscience is clear." "I believe you," Miss Marple said, her voice soothing. "But these letters may not be about you at all. They could be a diversion, meant to unsettle or distract. Tell me, has Mr. Harrow seemed himself lately?" Mr. Clement frowned. "He's been preoccupied, I'll admit. Always at the vestry, checking the books. I thought it was his injury weighing on him, but perhaps there's more." Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions deepening. "Keep this letter safe, Mr. Clement, and say nothing for now. I shall make further inquiries." As the vicar left, Miss Marple returned to her chair, her knitting untouched. Mr. Harrow's confession, partial though it was, had revealed a vulnerability, his past debts, his fear of exposure. Leonard Price, she suspected, knew of this weakness and was using it, perhaps to exact revenge or to force a reckoning. The letters, with their accusations against the vicar, might be a tactic to mask the true target. Mr. Harrow himself. She considered the scuffle she had witnessed. Leonard's words, "I know what you did," ringing in her memory. Mr. Harrow's denial of being at the church was a lie. But why? Was he protecting himself or someone else? And what role did the collection box play in this tangled web? Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the possibility of a larger secret, one that connected Leonard's grudge to Mr. Harrow's past and the church's quiet sanctity. Tomorrow, she would seek out Leonard himself, perhaps at the Blue Boar, where he lodged as Mr. Lane. A direct approach was risky, but Miss Marple knew that a man under pressure often betrayed his intentions in the face of calm scrutiny. For now, she set aside her thoughts and prepared for bed, the flicker of the fire casting shadows that seemed to dance with the secrets of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 7. The Truth Unveiled. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting intricate patterns on the polished floor. She sat at her breakfast table, her tea cooling as she turned over the events of the past days. The stranger at the church gate, confirmed as Leonard Price, had stirred a quiet storm in St. Mary Mead. His confrontation with Mr. Harrow, the cryptic letters accusing the vicar, and the tampered collection box formed a pattern that Miss Marple was now close to unravelling. She knew the time had come to bring the threads together, to confront the players in this drama, and lay bare the truth. With her characteristic foresight, Miss Marple sent notes to Mr. Clement, Mrs. Price, Mr. Harrow, and Leonard Price, still posing as Mr. Lane at the Blue Boar, inviting them to the vicarage that evening. Her message was polite but firm, suggesting a discussion to resolve the recent disturbances at the church. She worded it carefully, knowing that each recipient would feel compelled to attend, whether out of curiosity, guilt, or fear of exposure. As she prepared for the day, Miss Marple's mind was clear, her resolve unshaken. She had seen such patterns before, grudges nursed in silence, secrets buried but never forgotten, and she knew that truth, like a buried seed, would always find its way to the light. The vicarage parlour, warmed by a modest fire, was a picture of understated comfort as the group gathered that evening. Mr. Clement, nervous but trusting, welcomed his guests with a strained smile. Mrs. Price sat stiffly, her eyes darting between her nephew and Mr. Harrow, her disapproval palpable. Mr. Harrow, his ledger absent but his limp pronounced, avoided Leonard's gaze, his fingers fidgeting with a button on his coat. Leonard, lean and hollow-cheeked, stood by the window, his hat discarded but his expression guarded. Miss Marple, seated in a corner with her knitting in her lap, observed them all, her demeanour serene, but her eyes as sharp as ever. "Thank you for coming," she began, her voice gentle but carrying the quiet authority of one who knew more than she revealed. "St. Mary Mead has been troubled of late, by a stranger, by letters, by suspicions. I believe we can put these matters to rest tonight, if we speak plainly." Mr. Clement cleared his throat. "Miss Marple, I'm grateful for your help, but I confess I'm at a loss. These letters, they accuse me of sins I've not committed. I want only to protect the church." Mrs. Price snorted, her gaze fixed on Leonard. "If anyone's to blame, it's him," she said, pointing a thin finger. "My nephew, back after all these years, stirring trouble. I knew you were the stranger, Leonard. What are you after?" Leonard's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, his eyes flickering toward Mr. Harrow. Miss Marple noted the tension, her needles clicking softly as she spoke. "Mr. Price," she said, addressing him directly, "or should I say, Mr. Lane, you've caused quite a stir since your return. Perhaps you'd care to explain why you've been watching the church, and why you tried to open the collection box." Leonard's face darkened, but he held her gaze. "I have nothing to say," he muttered. "I came to St. Mary Mead for my own reasons, private reasons." Miss Marple's smile was mild, but her words were precise. "Private, perhaps, but not without consequence. I saw you at the church last night, Mr. Price, with a tool in your hand, attempting to open the collection box, and I saw you," Mr. Harrow interrupt him. "You spoke of something he knew, something you did. Shall we discuss it openly?" Mr. Harrow's face went ashen, and he gripped the arm of his chair. "Miss Marple, I don't know what you mean. I was at home last night. My leg, you see. Your leg, Miss Marple interrupted gently, is quite distinctive, Mr. Harrow. It was unmistakable in the churchyard, even in the dark. You confronted Mr. Price, and he accused you of something from the past. I think it's time we heard the truth. The room fell silent, the crackle of the fire the only sound. Leonard's eyes burned with a mixture of anger and defiance, while Mr. Harrow's shoulders slumped, as if the weight of his secret had grown too heavy to bear. Mrs. Price, her lips pursed, watched her nephew with a mixture of scorn and fear. Mr. Clement looked from one to the other, his confusion evident. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Let me suggest a story," she said, her voice calm but compelling. "Years ago, before you came to St. Mary Mead, Mr. Harrow, you served as a churchwarden in another parish, Lymstock, I believe. There you faced financial difficulties, as you admitted to me. In your desperation, you took money from the church funds. Not much, perhaps, but enough to be noticed. You covered it well, and when questions arose, suspicion fell on a young man in the parish, a man named Leonard Price." Leonard's head snapped up, his fists clenching. "You've no proof," he said, his voice low but fierce. "You can't know that." Miss Marple's eyes met his unflinching. "I know human nature, Mr. Price, and I know that suspicion, once cast, is hard to shake. You were accused of theft in Lymstock, though never convicted. You left under a cloud, carrying a grudge against the man who escaped blame, Mr. Harrow. When you learned he was here in St. Mary Mead, you returned to expose him. The letters to the vicar, accusing him of sin, were a ruse to sow fear and draw attention, weren't they? Your real target was Mr. Harrow." Mr. Harrow's face crumpled, and he buried his head in his hands. "It's true," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I took the money, years ago. I meant to pay it back, but I couldn't. When Leonard was blamed, I let it happen. I was ashamed, but I thought it was behind me. Then he came back, and the letters started. I knew it was him." Leonard sprang to his feet, his voice rising. "You ruined me!" he shouted. "I lost everything. My name, my home. I came here to make you confess, to show the village what you are. The collection box was just to scare you, to make you think I'd tell." Mrs. Price gasped, her hand at her throat. "Leonard, you fool! You drag us all through the mud for your revenge." Mr. Clement, his face pale, raised a hand. "Enough," he said. "This must stop. Mr. Harrow, your confession clears the air, but it's a grave matter. And you, Mr. Price, your actions have caused harm, whatever your reasons." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene but resolute. "Mr. Price, your grievance is understandable, but your methods have hurt more than just Mr. Harrow. The letters frightened the village, and your tampering with the collection box could have led to greater trouble. Mr. Harrow, you've admitted your fault, and that is a start. I suggest you make amends, perhaps by resigning your post and settling your debt, if you can." Mr. Harrow nodded, his eyes downcast. "I will. I'll speak to the bishop tomorrow. I can't stay on, not after this." Leonard, his anger spent, sank back into his chair. "I only wanted the truth," he said, his voice hollow. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." Mrs. Price's expression softened, though her voice remained sharp. "You should have come to me, Leonard. We could have sorted this without all this nonsense." Miss Marple rose, her presence commanding despite her slight frame. "The truth is out now," she said. "Mr. Price, I suggest you leave St. Mary Mead and let the past rest. The village has no need of further disruption. Mr. Clement, I trust you'll handle this with discretion, for the sake of all involved." The vicar nodded, his relief evident. "I will, Miss Marple. Thank you, for everything." As the group dispersed, Leonard lingered, his eyes meeting Miss Marple's. "You're a sharp one," he said quietly. "I didn't expect anyone to see through it." Miss Marple's smile was gentle. "The human heart is predictable, Mr. Price, yet always surprising. Go now, and make a better future." He nodded, a flicker of respect in his gaze, and left without another word. Miss Marple returned to her cottage, the night air cool against her face. The truth had been unveiled, as she had known it would, and St. Mary Mead could settle back into its quiet rhythm. As she closed her door, she murmured, "A village is a small place, but its secrets are never small." With that, she turned to her knitting, content that order had been restored. Chapter 8. The Village Restored. With the mystery of the stranger at the church gate resolved, St. Mary Mead awoke to a morning of serene clarity, as if the village itself exhaled a sigh of relief. The autumn sun cast a golden glow over the green, and the air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves, mingling with the faint chime of St. Mary's bell, calling the faithful to morning prayer. Miss Jane Marple, seated by her window with her knitting in hand, observed the familiar rhythm of village life resuming. Mrs. Weatherby hurrying to the post office, Mr. Giles unloading crates at his shop, and children scampering toward the schoolhouse. The storm stirred by Leonard Price's return had passed, leaving the village tranquil once more. Miss Marple's thoughts, as her needles clicked softly, turned to the events of the previous evening. The confrontation at the vicarage had laid bare the truth. Leonard's vendetta against Mr. Harrow, the churchwarden's long-buried guilt, and the letters designed to unsettle and expose. Her quiet intervention had brought clarity, sparing St. Mary Mead the scandal that might have followed. Mr. Harrow had promised to resign and make amends, while Leonard, chastened by the exposure of his scheme, had agreed to leave the village. Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for human nature, knew that such resolutions, though delicate, would hold, provided no new grievances arose. She rose to prepare tea, her movements deliberate, and reflected on the village's resilience. St. Mary Mead, like all small places, had its share of secrets, but it also had a way of healing itself, of smoothing over disruptions with the gentle persistence of time. As she set the kettle to boil, a knock at the door announced the arrival of Mr. Clement, his face brighter than it had been in days. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, stepping into the parlour with a tentative smile. "I hope I'm not intruding, but I wanted to thank you again for your help. The village feels lighter today, as if a cloud has lifted." Miss Marple gestured to a chair, pouring tea with her usual grace. "You're very welcome, Mr. Clement. I'm glad to see peace restored. How are matters at the church?" The vicar accepted the cup, his expression thoughtful. "Mr. Harrow came to me this morning," he said. "He's written to the bishop, resigning his post as churchwarden. He spoke of repaying the funds he took years ago, though it will take time. I believe he's sincere, Miss Marple. He seemed almost relieved to have it out in the open." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes warm with understanding. Confession, even a forced one, can lighten the heart. "And Mr. Price, has he left the village?" "He was seen at the station this morning," Mr. Clement replied. "Mrs. Carter's boy said he boarded the early train to London, carrying a small bag and looking rather subdued. I hope he finds a better path." "As do I," Miss Marple said softly. "Grudges are heavy burdens, Mr. Clement. They wear a man down more than he realises." The vicar hesitated, then added, "I've taken steps to secure the church. New locks for the collection box and the vestry. I don't expect further trouble, but it's best to be cautious. And Mrs. Price, she sent a note asking to help with the harvest festival. I think she feels some responsibility for her nephew's actions." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "Mrs. Price is a proud woman, but her heart is not unkind. A task will do her good, and the village will benefit from her energy." As Mr. Clement took his leave, Miss Marple returned to her window, her gaze resting on the church across the green. Its stone walls, weathered by centuries, stood as a quiet testament to the village's endurance. She thought of Leonard Price, driven by a wound that had festered too long, and of Mr. Harrow, whose guilt had shadowed his days until it was brought to light. The letters, the tampered lock, the stranger's vigil, all had been pieces of a puzzle that, once assembled, revealed the simple truth of human frailty. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the village shop, where the talk was already turning to the harvest festival and the new churchwarden to be appointed. Mrs. Carter, behind the counter, greeted her with a nod. "It's a relief, Miss Marple, to have things quiet again," she said. "No more strangers lurking about, thank goodness." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, selecting a tin of biscuits with care. "A village thrives on its routines, Mrs. Carter. Disruptions come and go, but St. Mary Mead always finds its balance." As she stepped outside, she paused to watch a group of children playing near the church gate, their laughter echoing across the green. The gate, once the stage for Leonard's silent vigil, now stood open, welcoming rather than ominous. Miss Marple's thoughts turned philosophical as she made her way home. People carry their pasts like shadows, she mused, but a village, with its watchful eyes and steady heart, knows how to let them fade. Back at her cottage, she settled by the fire, her knitting resumed. The lace shawl, nearly complete, was a testament to her patience, each stitch a small act of order in a world prone to chaos. She thought of the many mysteries she had encountered in St. Mary Mead, each one a reminder that beneath the surface of everyday life lay currents of ambition, regret, and redemption. The stranger at the church gate had been but one more thread in the village's tapestry, now woven into its history and set to rest. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the green, Miss Marple set her needles aside. The village was quiet, its secrets safe for now. With a contented sigh, she rose to draw the curtains, her heart light with the knowledge that her quiet observation had, once again, preserved the peace of St. Mary Mead.